Let knowledge serve the city. This is the purpose of the university. Our work is for you, the community, and the opportunities these colloquia provide to share our work with you are invaluable. Now, this might be the point at which I cite some statistics to show the value of the arts and humanities, the successes of graduates, and the number of employers who value the skills developed in the study of the arts and humanities. However, I'd like to take a humanities approach to the topic and read you a poem I taught last week by the Polish Nobel laureate Wisława Szymborska. The poem is called Starvation Camp near Yazwo. Write it down. Write it. With ordinary ink on ordinary paper, they weren't given food. They all died of hunger. All? How many? It's a large meadow. How much grass per head? Write down. I don't know. History rounds off skeletons to 0. 1,001 is still only 1,000. That one seems never to have existed. A fictitious fetus, an empty cradle, a primer open for no one. Air that laughs, cries and grows, stares for a void bounding out to the garden, no one's spot in the ranks. It became flesh right here, on this meadow, but the meadow's silent, like a witness who's been bought. Sunny, green, a forest close at hand, with wood to chew on, drops beneath the bark to drink, a view served round the clock, until you go blind. Above, a bird whose shadow flicked its nourishing wings across their lips. Jaws dropped, teeth clattered. At night, a sickle glistened in the sky and reaped the dark for dreamed of loaves. Hands came flying from blackened icons, each holding an empty chalice. A man swayed on a grill of barbed wire. Some sang with dirt in their mouths, that lovely song about war hitting you straight in the heart. Write how quiet it is. Yes. The affirmation and the exhortation to write it down remind us what the arts and humanities do. The making of art, making and performance of plays and music, writing and studying literature, studying languages, researching histories, learning about cultures, these activities comprise nothing less than the exploration of what it means to be human. To live on this earth, and to be in some form of relationship to the world and other living beings around us, to know ourselves. As such, study in the arts and humanities is what education is meant to be, transformative. In another of her poems, Szymborska reflects on being asked by a correspondent how we should live. Today's colloquium will explore how some have answered that question. There will be time for questions afterward, but now I would like to call on my colleague, Dr. Daniel Burgoyne, to introduce today's presenters. Daniel?
I have the pleasure of introducing today's speakers, two of my colleagues from the English department, Dr. Anna Atkinson and Dr. Toni Smith. Anna Atkinson completed her Bachelor of Arts honors in English from the University of Calgary with a minor in French and a subspecialization in classics. She then attended Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, where she was awarded 2 consecutive Shirk scholarships and a teaching fellowship while completing both a Master of Arts, and a PhD. Her doctoral dissertation, completed in 2001 under the supervision of Dr. Paul Stevens and Dr. Laura Murray, is entitled "Fruitful in the Land of My Afflictions, Narratives of Captivity and Female Self-Fashioning, 1666 to 1824." It appears in the Margaret Cavendish Bibliography Initiative of the International Margaret Cavendish Society. The dissertation examines the role of narratives of captivity in the creation of feminine identity in England, France, and America. After completing her PhD, Anna taught in the departments of English and Women's Studies at Queen's University, and then in the English department at the Royal Military College of Canada, before coming home to Nanaimo to teach at Vancouver Island University in 2003. Anna has a deep interest in the role narratives have in the creation of identity, culture, and cultural identity. This, combined with more concretized, if informal, study in the fields of agronomy and ecology, and a deepening environmental awareness inspired by such writers as Aldo Leopold, John Muir, Arnie Nass, and Wendell Berry, have led to her current study in the field of ecosophy, and I had to look that up. It is ecological philosophy. Her most recent work is an essay entitled "We're in the Wrong Story," published in the Trumpeter, Journal of Ecosophy. This essay explores the role of Western archetypal genres in the development of the current model of industrial civilization. Anna is the proud daughter of a farmer's daughter, and beginning in 2007, became a farmer herself when she and her husband purchased Sparrowhawk Farm in the Cinnabar Valley south of Nanaimo, where they raise heritage livestock and heirloom vegetables in an attempt to practice sustainable horticulture. She holds a certificate in permacultural design from the Permaculture Institute of Australia, and she has cleaned more chicken coops and threw more compost than she cares to remember. Toni Smith grew up in Vancouver and had a pretty standard urban upbringing in many ways. She completed a Bachelor of Arts in English at McGill, a Master of Arts in English at UVic, and in 2008, she finished her PhD at the University of Alberta. Her dissertation looked at how perceptions of ethnicity and whiteness changed in Canada and in Canadian literature over the course of the 20th century. And it also looked at the role that Scottish identity, at once white and ethnic, played in the development of the figure of the ordinary white Canadian. She has published on John Murray Gibbon and the production of the Canadian citizen in the 1930s, as well as on issues of race and ethnicity in the writings of Alistair MacLeod. Toni has taught at the University of Alberta, the University of Victoria, Camosun College, and has been teaching here at VIU since 2007. At the post-PhD psychological crossroad, now what? A friend said to her, "You should do something in line with your passion, which is food, obviously." Aha! It was true. Through all the years of education and training, food had always been the obsession in the background. Over the last few years, Toni has been working to integrate her personal interests in food production, culture, and history with her academic interests in Canadian literature, post-colonial, and cultural studies. In 2011, for instance, she delivered a paper at Congress titled "Local Feast food, culture, and identity in Timothy Taylor's Stanley Park and Bill Gaston's The Order of Good Cheer. Toni and her husband produce most of their own fruit, vegetables, eggs, chicken, and hops for beer, on less than half an acre outside of Cowichan Bay. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anna Atkinson and Dr. Toni Smith.
Possibly is probably a lot harder to say than it is to actually understand.
What Daniel didn't tell you is that he has the office between Anna and I, and he spends probably too much time listening to us go back and forth in our offices, giggling about composted chickens on a daily basis. So thank you for those introductions. As you can tell from those bios, Anna and I have both felt the pull to go back to the land. We have our own emotional and practical stake in our topic today. But we've recognized over these last few years that we're but two of many people acting on that same impulse today. We recognize that we are recycling a narrative that has been played out in North America many times over the decades. We started talking about why that might be, why past movements have been considered to have failed, and why we felt like we needed to try again, regardless of those lessons of the past. We also started to commiserate about the challenges of this lifestyle and put on our academic hats about why those might be. What might be the limitations of our back to the land impulses? And might there be a way out of the reenactment of these cycles?
So I went back to the land in 2007, as my bio sort of points out, when my husband and I bought this 21-acre property south of Nanaimo in the Sinamar. The property is part of the ELR, the Agricultural Land Reserve, and we began to farm, or perhaps more accurately, to do what is now referred to as homestead. What I mean by this is that rather than growing commercial crops for sale, we wanted to provide as much as possible for our own needs. The goal is a kind of self-reliance and self-sufficiency rather than cash cropping. This lifestyle was not as much of a leap for an English professor in an urban center as you might think. My grandfather was one of the last homesteaders in the North Thompson Valley, and his stead was sold up in 1956 due to his failing health. He never recovered from the sale, and nor in many ways did my mother, who in spite of being trained as a teacher, always imagined going back to the farm to work with her father, and of course to teach, to ensure sufficient income to keep the farm running. Working off the farm has a very long history. And such was my family's history, and I thought little of it until in the midst of researching farming and homesteading methods, I ran across this little gem of a book called The Havmore Plan, A Little Land and a Lot of Living. It was originally published, as the fashion code makes clear, in 1944, and it outlines how to go back to the land and provide a good, clean living for your family. Here's the interesting thing. It predates my grandparents' removal from their farm to North Vancouver, a move that was my grandfather's first away from the land and into the city. This paradox of people going back to the land before the previous homesteaders had actually left, in many ways prompted the title of this presentation. But what's also interesting is that the Havmore Plan was republished in 1973 at the height of the Back to the Land movement that most of us are most familiar with. But 10 years after the Havmore Plan was originally published, that is in 1954, Scott and Helen Mearing's Living the Good Life came out and recounted their move from the city to a hardscrabble rock farm in 1932. And in 1979, their follow-up volume, Continuing the Good Life, became a touchstone of that same Back to the Land movement. 1932, 1944, 1954, 1973, 1979, 2007. In the 20th and 21st centuries at least, in North America, the idea of going back to the land, well, it comes back. In fact, even in the 1930s, the movement was a reconstitution. The original Back to the Land movement, and the one that popularized the phrase that has given subsequent movements their titles, was actually due to the work of a guy named Bolton Hall, an Irish-American labor and anti-poverty activist, a social anarchist, founder of the Little Land League, and proponent of vacant lot gardening. It might astonish you, as it did me, to find that Bolton Hall was operating at the turn of the 20th century, and his book, A Little Land and a Living, was published in 1908 and influenced Ralph Borsodi, who began going back to the land in that same year, inspired by Hall's work. Borsodi's own text, Flight from the City, came out in 1933 and inspired in part the agrarian wave that the Nearings were on the forefront of. He even started a Back to the Land institute called the School of Living, and in 1948 he wrote and self-published the textbook for that, called Education in Living. So as a scholar of American literature, this got me thinking. I wondered just how often Americans went back to the land. What I discovered is that this is an idea that is not only foundational to America, it simply never goes away. Its roots are the roots of the nation itself, and its reiterations have distinct similarities, although they can appear quite different. I've got a few pictures here of the differences you can expect to see. So there's Scott and Helen Nearing in probably 1940s by that point. And this is The Egg and I, which is this hilarious account of this woman who marries a man who decides he's going to start a chicken ranch in about the 1950s. And this was actually made into a feature-length Hollywood film. And then you have the more familiar iterations of this, like this sort of nouveau American Gothic, which looks, unhealthy. And then you've got, the more healthy version of that we're used to seeing, the sort of the granola kind of thing that is iconic in California at least. And then you get sort of the more recent iterations, which run the gamut from sort of this kind of image to this kind of image. So it's very interesting, the number of different things that's back to the land can mean.
The 21st century incarnation of this movement has its roots in the voluntary simplicity and animal rights movements of the 1990s. Public awareness of the potentially serious consequences of climate change builds throughout the early 2000s and gets a major boost with Al Gore's film An Inconvenient Truth in 2006. Issues of food safety, American obesity and health, genetic modification, concentrated animal feedlots, and concerns about the security of the industrial food system gained growing attention throughout the 2000s through bestsellers like Eric Schlosser's Fast Food Nation, which came out in 2001 and then was made into the movie in 2006, Fatland in 2004, Deborah Coons-Garcia's documentary The Future of Food, which was also 2004. These sent thousands of North American consumers looking for other food options. Those concerns reached a tipping point with the 2007 publication of Michael Pollan's bestseller, The Omnivore's Dilemma. Pollan exposed a mainstream audience to the dysfunction of industrial food, but he also revealed the underbelly of the organic food movement, to which so many who were already concerned about their food supply had turned. In Pollan's personal journey, he ended up back in his garden, growing his own food, and being willing to hunt and find other ways to procure it from ethical sources. Pollan also brought permaculture and other beyond organic farming possibilities to the fore and made celebrities out of unconventional farmers like Joel Salatin. In 2008, of course, the Great Recession hit, and suddenly everyone was looking back to the 1930s, to the Great Depression, for examples of how to live, even how to survive. What they found was the backyard homestead. Annette Kutralik, a typical suburban mom, for example, in December 2008, after reading The Omnivore's Dilemma, decided she was opting her Seattle family out of industrial food. She started the blog Sustainable Eats and documented her family's journey from cleaning out her overstuffed pantry full of processed food to following her new rules of food buying. Everything brought into her family's kitchen needed to be seasonal, locally and ethically produced, organic or fair trade sourced, or grown in the US. Over the next 3 years, she transformed her 8,700 square foot city lot into a backyard homestead that produced most of her family's veggies and fruit, as well as meat, rabbits, and eggs from ducks and chickens. By 2011, she and a friend had published the Urban Farm Handbook, and by 2012, she had left her urban farm to a property outside Seattle to homestead and farm in earnest. The concerned mom contingent of contemporary homesteading is a large one, especially when we include the American Christian right. Mormons and evangelical Christian groups often encourage preparedness for coming hard times, as you can see here, or simply keeping a year's supply of food on hand, traditional gender roles, and large families that require frugal money management and big gardens. Another stream of contemporary homesteaders are the now grown children of the 1970s hippies. Although my parents didn't specifically go back to the land themselves, I was born in 1973 to a community of guitar-playing, literally kumbaya singing 20-year-olds. I've realized that my vivid childhood memories of parents and grandparents canning fruit, sewing clothes, growing vegetables, and having time to play aren't unique, but they are markers of a generational turn. When 2008 hit and interest returned to the frugal ways of the past, my generation has memories, perhaps nostalgic ones, of secure, worry-free childhoods, but concrete experiences nonetheless that we've latched onto. Whatever the reasons, the first decade of the 21st century has seen another explosion of interest in going back to the land, even if that land is only the small backyard you already live in. But there has been regular debate about how to define what we're doing. Nobody seems to be merely gardening. Instead, we are urban farming, householding, radical homemaking. Emily Natchar's new book on the movement, Homeward Bound, is subtitled The Cult of the New Domesticity. But despite the attempts to rebrand, the most powerful descriptor and identifier remains homesteading. So what is it about the idea, the symbol of the homestead, that draws people from such different walks of life? Why has it remained such a powerful identifier, even as the definition shifts a little with each generation who takes it on and embodies it? Some immediate answers spring to mind. Most white North Americans associate the homestead with self-sufficiency. We think of early settlers heading west, clearing new ground, and having to fend for themselves in every way. We remember our ancestral stories of farming, the hard work, the intense family and community bonds, the bounty of summer and fall, even if the winters were long and without much comfort. Even though we know these were difficult lives, they are stories of nation building, and the hardships were celebrated, endured with pride for all the hard work that paid off. And perhaps most importantly today, these are largely pre-industrial stories. They are the most recent and most present stories we can relate to that, in our collective consciousness, seem to predate the ills of modern industrial urban life. These associations are powerful, but they are, of course, problematic.
One problem that becomes clear when back to the land narratives are examined is that the land that is being gone back to is never really the land that is actually there. In fact, the land seems to be interpreted as something that boils down to this: someplace better than where we came from. It's key here that it is not in any way where we actually came from. So the word back is problematic. The superimposition of a European model of a mixed family homestead onto a North American indigenous landscape, such as the picture here from, is this Currier or not?
Very
nice. Suggests that when we say back to the land, we mean to transport ourselves in time and the land in space. Thus the words back and land never seem to mean precisely what we want them to. And there are some things that we very much want these words to mean. Going back to the land has come to symbolize freedom in the sense that it provides both an escape from oppression, real or imagined, and a sense of control over one's own destiny. This escape from oppression and assertion of personal agency informs what we understand as the ethic behind going back to the land, which becomes loosely defined as the attempt to escape an unjust and oppressive system and connect with the natural world in a harmonious way that provides for a simple but dignified existence while having a beneficial effect on the environment and promoting a more just, fair, and ethical world. No wonder we're tired all the time.
We're very tired.
However, the results of the movement are, in many cases, destructive to the landscape and natural systems, and are often in many ways oppressive to other beings, human and otherwise, particularly those who lived on the land before the back to the landers got there. Much of this seems nearly inevitable, given the roots that this really quite benevolent-sounding ethic have in the colonial gaze. I'm going to delve into the history of American colonization for an explanation of this. The romance of the Puritan and Pilgrim emigration from England, via the Netherlands for some, to North America tends to be romanticized as a flight from religious oppression to a land of liberty and bounty, where individuals are free to follow their own consciences. Many of us are familiar with the images of the so-called founding fathers arriving at last after an arduous journey on the shores of what became New England and rejoicing at the birth of a free and just society in a landscape as lush and bountiful as Eden. John Winthrop, a prominent figure in the Puritan movement who led the second large wave of Puritan immigrants from England in 1630, insisted that they would be building a city on a hill, a kind of demonstration to the world of how a free and just society ought to look. However, there are several problems with the perception of the migration to America by the Puritans as merely a flight from oppression to liberty. Those Puritans and Pilgrims who are remembered for founding many of the settlements in what became the United States were religious nonconformists whose Calvinist doctrines made them a target of a good bit of suspicion, prejudice, and, to be fair, oppression in England. However, this oppression, when the Civil War was not actively being fought, was not primarily military. Espousing Calvinism did not necessarily get one thrown in jail or executed, although this did occur from time to time. Rather, the government of England tried to control religious dissenters by banning them from holding public office, by, as historian Ronald Hutton has noted, simply fining people who didn't show up to the right sort of church at the appropriate time, and at times by confiscating land or goods belonging to dissenters. Thus, in England, the oppression that was religious in name had a strong economic component as well. Even the Pilgrims, a different group of dissenters who had already left England to settle in Amsterdam and then in Leyden in their search for religious and cultural freedom, prior to emigrating from there to America, felt economic pressure and wrote about it. William Bradford, who served as the leader of this group of colonists when they embarked from the Netherlands to America aboard the Mayflower in 1620, notes this in the reasons he gives for their departure from the Netherlands. He says, "And first they saw and found by experience the hardness of the place and country." And here, keep in mind, they're talking about the Netherlands, they're not talking about America yet. They found the hardness of the place and country to be such as few in comparison would come to them, and fewer that would bide it out and continue with them. For many could not endure that great labor and hard fare with other inconveniences which they underwent and were contented with. Being settlers in America, they thought, had to be far easier than living in the middle of a Dutch city. This clear economic motivation disrupts the notion that how hard could it be to live in a Dutch city? That liberty of conscience and freedom of religious expression were the sole reason for the Puritan and Pilgrim emigration. But upon examination, those very reasons were already vexed without the addition of economics to muddy the waters. While Pilgrim parents were observing how hard their more obedient children struggled to make a living and wanted to provide something better, healthier, and easier for them, the less obedient children also posed a problem. Bradford's congregation was concerned that they were becoming more Dutch than English. The difference could not be entirely religious. The Dutch Reformed Church was as Calvinist as the Pilgrims, although there were some key differences. However, there was a real fear of becoming absorbed by the Dutch culture and a real need to remain essentially English, even outside England. As Bradford reports, many of their children, by these occasions and in the great licentiousness of the youth in that country and the manifold temptations of the place, were drawn away by evil examples into extravagant and dangerous courses, getting the reins off their necks and departing from their parents. And really, it's that last phrase that he's actually concerned about. It's the fact that they actually don't do what their parents say. That's the problem. And this hints at something very strong within Puritan and Pilgrim culture, the insistence on social conformity, and the absolute intolerance of those who questioned the established authority of the leaders of the congregation, an attitude that the persecution and martyring of Quakers in Boston in 1660 makes clear. Of course, this is all in addition to the better-known hypocrisy of the demonization and persecution and/or evangelistic fervor with which the new settlers approached the original inhabitants of America. So much for religious and cultural freedom as a motivator for the Mayflower voyage. But where did the idea that going to America would be easier and that life would be simpler, cleaner, and more moral come from? In a word, marketing. The tracts that describe the so-called New World referred to Eden and paradise in their descriptions of the landscape, and various locales were called and are still called things like New Canaan, evoking images of a land of milk and honey that the descriptions mirrored. One of the most iconic of the tracts describing America at this time is called Nova Britannia. Published in 1609, it describes America in terms of a nurturing female body, with land that yieldeth naturally for the sustentation of man, and goes on to list the various resources contained therein. These resources begin with those that feed people, fish, flesh, and fruit, but quickly begin to list instead those resources that would feed an economy. Quote, there are hills and mountains making a sensible puffer of hidden treasure, the tract says, and the land is full of minerals and plenty of woods. It adds, these are the wants of England. In that tiny phrase lies a key to understanding exactly what is going on in many of the tracts and papers about America, and the reason behind the push to convince such groups as Bradford's congregation to think that life in a colony would be easier than life in a Dutch city. There are resources that need to be removed. The land is to be put to English industrial use. Quote, if their nature be so amiable in its naked kind, continues the tract, what may we hope when art and nature both shall join and strive together to give best content to man and beast? The form that this art will take becomes clear quite quickly. The trees will be burned to make ash or lime in order to make soap. Timber will also be used to make ships, both for trade and for war, as well as to make decorations for upper-class housing in England. Iron and copper will be mined, and pitch, tar, and turpentine made. Thousands, says the tract's author, will be put to work. More importantly, the resources of England will be preserved at home, so that the wasting of the English landscape will cease. In short, England's population had pretty much outgrown its ability to provide for itself, and the native timber had long since been used. There was a dearth of nearly every necessary natural resource. What the so-called New World promised was exactly what England lacked, or at least lacked in sufficient quantity: timber, farmland, and ore. In a sense, what England lacked was self-sufficiency. And it was this beyond anything else that the New World promised the colonial investors, whose ventures required willing workers in the form of industrious settlers looking for a better way of life. So they then found people to populate the colonies by marketing the land as both empty and productive. Thus, the idea that all that motivated the English to come to America was the need for freedom, religious or otherwise, is flawed at its roots. The reasons were complex and varied, but had a lot to do with the desire for national as well as individual self-reliance, and economic as well as religious freedom. How then to legitimize claims to the lands and resources the English had just owned? Nova Britannia also provides an excellent example of how the necessary fantasy of empty land was created and perpetrated. In language that is as useful as it is ugly, the First Nations of America are described as a wild and savage people that live and lie up and down in troops like herds of deer in a forest. They are otherwise described only by their lack of Englishness, and we are told that they are easy to be brought to good and would fain embrace a better condition. Combined with the imagery of the land as productive and Edenic, as a woman, and as virginal, the English tracts describing America conspired to create a sense of emptiness and untouched potential, that idea of the untouched wilderness, when nothing could have been further from the truth. In his brilliant book, 1491, Charles C. Mann details the extent to which America's original inhabitants tended, altered, and imprinted the landscape in a way that combined, in Nova Britannia's words, art and nature for the benefit of its inhabitants. The fact that the practices were different from those in England, which, by Nova Britannia's own admission, were laying waste to the English countryside, is no excuse for the refusal to recognize them, particularly considering that the English were quite ready to appropriate any supplies of corn they happened to find cached and stored for the winter. And they did this quite often. Hey, look, here's some corn, let's just eat that. These were just more resources to take advantage of in a land that seemed full of everything England needed. Thus, the fantasy of liberty, community, and clean living has always been tainted by a tie to an industrial cultural model. And it is this model that drives a further and perhaps much darker side to the idea of the utopian rural model upon which America is based, and to which many back-to-the-landers turn. The industrial model, combined with the colonial attitude, leads to the colonial gaze, since in order for occupation and access to resources to seem just and reasonable, not only do the resources and land have to be there, they have to be seen as empty and unclaimed.
We see the same pattern continuing in the 19th century, during the time period most of us associate with homesteading. The Homestead Acts were enacted in North America starting in 1862 in the US, just after the Civil War, and in Canada in 1872. The Acts were designed to redistribute lands and settle them newly acquired through treaty, outright purchase, or appropriation by their respective governments. The state goals were multi-layered: contain or remove Aboriginal peoples, create new markets for the goods being manufactured in the increasingly industrial East and feed that growing population, expand and build the new nations, fulfilling imperial dreams and manifest destiny, move settlement west to compete for occupation of the continent with all its resources, and to give land to those made promises during the colonial wars in exchange for their military and political support. So from a colonial state perspective, homesteading had a political, expansionist, imperial purpose. At the same time, that expansionist goal had to be served by individual immigrants and settlers. And though the recruitment of propaganda was dazzling, we know that the actual family journeys were incredibly difficult in the best cases, and heartbreaking and fatal in the worst. Literature and popular culture helped individuals struggling with the hardship of making the homestead dream a reality feel connected to that larger national destiny. Stories of settlers barely managing to eke out a living on newly cleared land after years of backbreaking physical labor are celebrated as allegories of national conquest. Novels like Willa Cather's My Antonia, after whom I am named, Frederick Philip Grove's Settlers of the Marsh, Ralph Connor's Sky Pilot and the Foreigner, Robert Stead's Grain, among many others, were written at the turn of the century. And they reveal the trauma and sometimes tragic but heroic experiences of immigrant settlers in the West. Characters pursue their dreams of owning their own lands and developing prosperity for their families. And despite their hardships, the nobility of those goals and their emotional attachment to the land itself come through powerfully. Their stories bring to life Frederick Jackson Turner's 1893 frontier thesis that American values of independence and equal opportunity came directly from the physical experience of developing the frontier, that American democracy, quote, came out of the American forest. Homesteading is thus a foundational national narrative in North America, and it's perhaps natural that a tradition so valorized would be the one that people looking for an alternative to modern city life might turn to again and again. Popular culture follows those cycles closely. Laura Ingalls Wilder's series of Little House on the Prairie books began publication in 1935 and accompanied the post-war return to agricultural life that swept up many. The TV production of Little House begins in 1974, at the height of the 1970s homesteading movement, and runs until the early 80s. The children of those 70s homesteaders were raised on both the books and the TV series, and those popular culture references mark much of the community trying to homestead today.
What?
So homesteading inspires self-sufficiency, small farm agriculture, dreams of economic and family prosperity, and has been a resilient symbol for more than a century. What's the problem? There are several. First, homesteading is a white colonial narrative whose resilience and power really only resonates with white North Americans. Even Clifford Sifton, the Canadian Minister of the Interior, who famously or infamously recruited Eastern European immigrants to Canada in the early 20th century, was very clear that he was still recruiting white settlers whom he hoped could assimilate into Canadian culture even as they helped build the country. Whatever its personal glory for the settler, the Homestead Acts were designed to settle occupied territories and claim them from First Nations people. Indigenous and African Americans have little nostalgia for this era in history and would not choose to model a future sustainable society on it. Second, homestead farming is a colonial policy wrought on the land. Homesteading brought a European model of agriculture and food production to North America with no consideration of whether the land being developed was suitable for this kind of farming. In some places, those European practices led to the Dust Bowls of the 1920s and 30s. In all places, this model of agriculture cleared forests and savanna ecosystems. And of course, attempts at homesteading on really poor land destroyed many lives and families. Those inspired to homestead today are often, but not always, drawing on this same family farm tradition as a model of sustainability. But that perception is worthy of great debate from an ecological perspective. In other words, there's a great irony that those, including us, who want to opt out of a corrupt modern life and create an earth-friendly, harmonious existence, do so by imitating exactly those practices that destroyed the land and created modern industrial life in the first place. The back in Back to the Land has often, under the surface, meant moving backward in time to the homestead that birthed the nation. Contemporary homesteaders are trying to flee. Third, 19th century homesteading, when it worked best, was a family farm system that relied on other cultural practices of the day, big families and gendered divisions of labor. At its best, even today, a homestead is a beautiful example of an integrated system with all parts supporting each other. A family cow grazes the pasture, a mower isn't necessary, and provides milk for the family and manure for the gardens. Surplus milk and hay go to other livestock like pigs and chickens, which provide meat for the family and manure for the gardens. A large family tends the animals and large garden, growing healthy through good food and physical labor, and family cohesion and well-being is created through shared purpose and the value of each pair of hands. There are enough hands to provide surpluses of labor, as well as of food and agricultural goods, products to sell for the little cash the family needs, and some time to study and pursue other interests when the many tasks are distributed. The tensions come quickly, though, when we try to impose that homestead model onto modern industrial life. A homestead isn't easy to scale down, although many try. The original Homestead Acts gave land for free to those who would develop them, but that was a one-time colonial appropriation deal. So the first problem comes when one needs to buy land to homestead on. Immediately, there must either be wealth before or an off-farm job to receive and pay off a mortgage. The next problem is the lack of desire, evangelical Christian homesteads accepted, for large families. With one partner at home with even 1 or 2 children, and one partner working off the farm, there is no surplus of labor. Most homesteading families, especially those in search of self-sufficiency, still attempt the full farm model: cows or goats, pigs, chicken, pasture, and produce gardens. But there often isn't time and labor, or in high land cost areas, space, to grow the feed for the livestock, or to process all the produce, which necessitates more off-farm inputs, which in turn need to be purchased with cash. As the 1970s homesteaders often realized, homesteading in modern times can become a slow process of financial ruin, even without the emotional or ecological strain. So paradoxically, the homesteading model itself may need to be abandoned if we want to accomplish the very goals that homesteading is striving for: ecological harmony, the construction of a more meaningful life outside the industrial capitalist system. After all, if our historical touchstones for a different lifestyle only go back to early colonial settlement, we can never reach sustainability. For that, we have to look to how First Nations lived in this place for millennia. But looking at those traditional lifestyles also forces us to acknowledge that settlement and industrialization have destroyed the ecosystems that allowed humans to live in this place in those sustainable ways. And this means we have to start thinking about ways to live that fit today's actual ecology, population, demographics, and industrial legacies.
So just another way to phrase this whole sort of series of problems is that back-to-the-land homesteading has a tendency to cannibalize itself. Just as the original colonies ended up replicating the intolerance that caused them to flee in the first place, later iterations of the pattern of fleeing oppression and returning to a simpler agrarian life do the same. What the Puritans and Pilgrims were doing was, on the surface, seeking to escape religious and in many cases economic oppression, enforced cultural conformity, and a confiscation or removal of their own land and resources. They were resisting their government and were moving to America in order to find freedom and prosperity through hard work. However, when they got to the land that was emblematic of freedom for them, they managed to reenact religious oppression both on each other and on the original inhabitants of the places they claimed as their own. In claiming those places, they made them unjustly available to those who had a right to them, and thus reenacted confiscation and removal of land. They then sent the resources back to England, the place they did not want to support. This is a pattern which continues in the mid-1800s, the time of Western expansion and so-called manifest destiny. When Henry David Thoreau does his experiment at Walden, the homesteaders that Toni was just describing were racing past him, seeking freedom from the city and from dependence on government and industry. John Michael Greer has pointed out that the increasingly urban and industrial eastern seaboard, like England 2 centuries before, had outgrown its resource base and needed to find ways to feed itself. However, this happens again at the expense of the people who were already there, and furthermore is made possible, even necessary, by the creation of the urban industrialized areas and a market for exactly the goods that the homestead farms would grow, and exactly those places they were trying hardest to escape. In addition, as with the original settlers, there was also a devastation of the land as a result of the imposition of foreign farming practices in unsuitable ecological regions. The early to mid-20th century offers another instance of the same pattern. The Nearings, for example, seek again to escape from what they see as an oppressive government and an untenable economic situation. They even name industrial capitalism as a major part of the problem, the same way others at the same time named the Red Menace, and moved to the countryside to escape. But even in so doing, in addition to the general lack of recognition of native land rights, they also create, with their fellow back-to-the-landers, a wave of population and demand for rural land that drives up both the price of land and the cost of living in rural areas, making it more difficult for the children of the people who already live there to continue with their own culture and lives. In fact, as James Kunstler has pointed out, this movement is implicated in the initiation of suburban sprawl. The attendant rise in land prices, of course, also means that the industrial model of civilization becomes necessary in order to create the work and monetary wealth that enables the purchase of the land to go back to. In the 1970s, the Vietnam War once again suggested an oppressive governmental regime which, depending on which side you favored, was either a stooge for the industrial capitalist system wreaking environmental destruction, or a front for an anti-democratic, freedom-hating, communist-sympathizing conspiracy of fear-mongering environmental freaks. Again, the answer for many was to move out to the countryside, and the results, at least to us in hindsight, as we examined this repeating phenomenon, became predictable. Ignoring of native land rights, imposition of foreign cultural and agricultural practices that were often environmentally destructive, increase in the cost of land and living that made work off the farm in the cities more necessary. In fact, rather than escaping from the city, in many ways, back-to-the-landers both brought it with them and made it necessary. As the millennium turned, the war was in the Middle East. Peak oil and climate change became big news. Governments were again seen as being corrupt, indifferent, ineffectual, or all of the above. And we can see the potential dangers of repeating the cycle. The key thing here is that in each repetition, two things tend to happen. The first is that there is a usually unrecognized reiteration of exactly the cultural, social, economic, and even environmental ills that the back-to-the-landers sought to avoid or escape. The second is that it becomes alarmingly clear that attempts to go back to the land become more and more dependent on the cultural model they attempted to undermine, particularly as the price of land goes up. Furthermore, the back-to-the-land movement seems to lose momentum after a period of a few years. The waves of people who go back to the land frequently turn around and go back to the city after a few years or decades, although some do stick it out. One possible reason for this is simply that the movement is not really to the land at all. Rather, it is away from whatever is identified as the oppressive force to be resisted. The movement tends to invoke a certain amount of self-righteousness and assumed, dare I say, puritanical moral authority, sometimes under the guise of religion, which tends to blind its adherents to their, or our, actual lack of rightness and authority, and their, or our, perpetuation of the same types of injustices and systemic abuses that they, or we, are attempting to undermine by leaving behind. However, interestingly, one way in which going back to the land may still have significant power and importance comes from Henry David Thoreau. Resistance to civil government and Walden are often, and sometimes it seems like always, published together, and the connection between the two forms part of the nexus of what has become a kind of cliche in the Back to the Land movement in the United States. This nexus is explored and critiqued in Thoreau's own generation by his friend and fellow author Nathaniel Hawthorne, whose participation in an early version of a transcendentalist hippie-type free-love back-to-the-land commune and the critical problems with such utopian communities is recounted in the novel The Blithedale Romance. One of the key problems Hawthorne notes is that the people who generally engage in such idealistic pursuits are themselves idealists, even ideologues. They are also frequently incurable romantics, and their backgrounds, I'm not romantic, and their backgrounds tend to favor poetry and politics rather than poultry management and hoop singing. That said, their ideas are frequently well worth examination, and one of the challenges is to try to tease apart the two very worthy projects, social reform and agrarian life. Thoreau's works are an excellent place to initiate this investigation. Perhaps no other single person has been so influential in the Back to the Land movement in the United States. Certainly more Back to the Landers have read Thoreau than Bolton Hall or Ralph Bersati. But while Thoreau is well known for the 2-year, 2-month, 2-day project he chronicled in Walden, he is at least equally well known for resistance to civil government. And it is at the intersection of these documents that we find the core of the Back to the Land movement that spans several centuries. At the very outset of resistance, Thoreau commends the motto, "That government is best which governs least," and immediately takes it to its most extreme conclusion. That government is best which governs not at all, because his argument runs, government is at best an expedient, but most governments are usually, and all governments are sometimes, inexpedient. Government is, he notes, equally liable to be abused and perverted before the people can act through it. And he uses the contemporary example of the Mexican War as an illustration of this abuse, and it's worthy of note here that the Mexican War is a war not unlike and resulting in similar protests to the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 70s and more recent wars in the Middle East. The key point of resistance to civil government is that citizens have a moral responsibility not to contribute to immoral governments. And Thoreau insists that citizens must not, even for a moment, or in the least degree, resign their consciences to the legislator. This question of conscience related to government comes up over and over in the Back to the Land movement. In fact, it is not unreasonable to assert that going back to the land is very often less about farming and more about politics. Thoreau's manifesto in resistance seems key. If I deny the authority of the state when it presents its tax bill, it will soon take and waste all my property and so harass me and my children without end. This is hard. This makes it impossible for a man to live honestly and at the same time comfortably in outward respects. It will not be worth the while to accumulate property. That will be sure to go again. You must hire or squat somewhere and raise but a small crop and eat that soon. You must live within yourself and depend upon yourself, always tucked up and ready for a start, and not have many affairs. What I'm trying to identify here is an uncomfortable paradox. It's quite easy to critique the idealistic fervor with which utopian dreamers embrace the romantic notion of going back to the land, and to mock the Blithedalian impracticality of, oh, let's just say it, English and philosophy professors attempting to grow potatoes and muck out chicken coops. But the other side of this is that Thoreau is quite right to complain that even in a democratic nation, there are precious few ways of resisting wars that our governments enter into, of which we don't approve. Or of resisting slavery, literally in Thoreau's time, but through an exploitative capitalist system in our own. or of resisting environmental degradation that we can easily see as both internationally and intergenerationally unjust. The allure of the move back to the land is that it is, or attempts, a removal from that system, a civil resistance to an economic and political structure through denying it the taxation revenues that would continue to support it, or, in a globalized economy, denying those same revenues to the international corporations by finding ways not to buy their products. But is this removal actually possible? Thoreau had supplies dropped off to him, often by his mother, regularly at Walden. The Nearings had a lot of help from neighbors and friends. In our own cases, we own cars and buy things and have to dress in particular ways and work at jobs off the land in order to pay for the land itself. Money still flowed and flows because in virtually every case, it's necessary. Which means that in every case, the removal from what was seen as the oppressive system is incomplete, and in some circumstances, a complete failure.
This recognition that it might not be possible, or even desirable, to opt out seems to be something becoming more prevalent in the current movement. There are many young people today recycling through the 1970s back to the land approach of buying rural property and trying to be almost completely self-sufficient. The more communal approaches to this choice are often referred to as lifeboat communities. This is, I don't know if you've seen this is Glenn Beck, who was a former Fox News commentator and now a radio host who wants to found one of these lifeboat communities, Independence USA. Most lifeboat communities don't have arms factories and walls around them, but his does. Rather than the free love utopias of the 1970s, these are survivalist groups trying to prepare for what they anticipate will be the coming apocalypse, zombie or otherwise. Others are similar to, or even legacies of, religious-based new agrarian communities. There's also a huge movement, particularly in the US, but in Canada as well, of young people trying to become farmers, both to replace the aging farmers who need to retire and also to try to reinvent farming in a more sustainable way. But I would argue that many people caught up in the current homesteading movement have consciously decided or are deciding not to drop out. This may be because of the financial inaccessibility of land, the feeling of job and health insurance insecurity that makes some young families unwilling to leave their urban jobs. It may be because we are less willing than in the past to abandon the comforts and conveniences of the modern world. After all, many of the 1970s back-to-the-landers lived in very rustic poverty that few of us are really willing to voluntarily step into today. But another important reason that many contemporary homesteaders are not leaving their urban and suburban homes is because they see the importance of what we call adapting in place. For many, the climate crisis, peak oil, or financial collapse doesn't feel like something that can be escaped, and many feel invested in the idea of making the whole communities that they live in more resilient, rather than fleeing to protect themselves. There's also the recognition that urban settings have real advantages over rural ones for certain types of greener living. Cheaper public transit or less need for a car, libraries and other valuable public services that are easily accessible in a neighborhood, a base of community activist groups that can create real local change. All of this has led to a redefinition of the idea of homesteading to include the seemingly paradoxical phrase, urban homesteading. The possibility of becoming more self-sufficient, even dropping out to a degree, without going back to the land. The Gervais family in Pasadena, California is at the center of this movement. In the mid-1980s, Jules Gervais, the father, who was himself a former back-to-the-lander in New Zealand, decided to try to gain as much independence as he could from the food and energy systems that he disagreed with politically. He began a serious attempt to grow as much food as possible for himself and his 4 children on his suburban 8,700 square foot lot. As the family and their efforts grew, he ended up with a business selling salad greens grown at home to local restaurants, which provided him with enough income to be more or less financially independent working from home. He started a website called The Path to Freedom, which to him meant freedom from oil companies and GMO food suppliers. The family held community movie nights, garden tours, and neighborhood meetings to help spread the word of what was possible, and their project and homestead kept growing. They began raising chickens, ducks, goats, and bees, and Jules's son began producing biodiesel. They did regular media appearances and even had a documentary made about their story. After the 2008 explosion of interest in their efforts, in 2010 they decided to trademark the phrase urban homestead and urban homesteading. They were successful, changed their Path to Freedom name to the Urban Homestead Project, and developed a blog named Little Homestead in the City. They have inspired many, but angered many others, also developing urban homesteading ideals of their own around the world. The controversy embittered the faithful, but the Gervais' family's redefinitions of homesteading have had a powerful influence on the public perception of the term. This is something that went viral on Pinterest if you're in that world. The trademark controversy also signals, though, that this movement may yet cannibalize itself, this time through commodification of the very idea of homesteading. After all, the Gervais' decision to essentially turn themselves into a kind of corporate brand was a recognition that the symbol of what they were doing could be something other than resistance. Suddenly, it had economic market value. And they are not alone in that recognition. The list of ways in which homesteading has become big business is long. And while there are few who would begrudge families trying to make a cash income from an extension of their homesteading activities, selling artisan products to wealthier demographics who are looking to own a piece of the dream life, you know that homesteading has hit the big time when even Williams & Sonoma, the ultra-exclusive kitchenware chain based in San Francisco, has started selling, you guessed it, compost supplies.
I'd just like you to check out the actual price of the compost.
Yes, that's almost $250. They also sell chicken coops. $1,800
$1,800
plus shipping.
And then you can buy, for another $100, a 25-foot roll of 2-foot wide hardware cloth and about 12 nails, and that's your predator proofing.
Just in case you buy your hardware supplies from Williams & Sonoma. With the current movement then still in flux, the question remains, can we move past these narrative cycles? Do we want to?
Perhaps the problem lies in the attempt to recreate the past, rather than looking to the past to inform a very different future. And perhaps the virtue of trying to resist cultural forces lies not in the perfection of success, but in the attempt at resistance itself. Perhaps liberty is worth pursuing in spite of the impossibility of ever being completely free. Perhaps a just society is worth working for, even if utopias are always both fictional and flawed. When Thoreau went to Walden, he wasn't trying to replicate anything, but merely to experience it. And at its best, this also resides at the heart of what we call the Back to the Land movement. The need to experience fully the life that is worth living, without looking at resistant cultural models such as the ones we're describing here. Most of the culture of the Western world has very few options other than to follow whatever models corporations and media companies dictate to us, through which we're locked into contributing to governments with whom we may profoundly disagree. The beauty of the movement is not in the idyllic picture of a new American Gothic, but rather in the proliferation of possibilities in a diverse cultural landscape in which we can create a new heritage, rather than desperately trying to replicate the old one that didn't work the first time. Thank you.